Okay, lots of people joining us from all over the place. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to kick us off. Welcome to this last meetup for the year for the Australasia Preserves Digital Preservation Community of Practice. This is a very special meetup today. It's discussing the politics of preservation, and it's been organised and run by Kieran Hegarty. My name is Jay Weatherburn. I work in digital preservation for both the University of Melbourne and the International Digital Preservation Coalition. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am today, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to elders past and present, extending that respect to all traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. Please, everybody, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know where you're dialing in from today. It is my pleasure, absolute pleasure to introduce this meetup today. I am here in my capacity as a co-organizer of the Australasia Preserves Community of Practice, and I'm joined today in this endeavour by my other co-organisers, Matthew Burgess, Andrea Goethals, Rachel Chopia, Leanne Raymond, and Dave Allen. These fine folks help to keep this community ticking along, helping organise these meetups, doing blog posts, social media, and helping to manage the AusPreserves forum and the website that we have. This community, it has over 400 members, and we're from a wide range of different sectors and domains in the Australasian region. Lots of individual representation from all kinds of different archives, libraries, records, from IT, government, universities, and other organisations. Community activities cover really varied interests and different areas of working with digitised and born digital materials. And it's a community that we foster so we can better share our digital preservation expertise and our knowledge with each other, and really bring together people who are dealing with very similar challenges when it comes to ongoing care and access for digital materials. We always welcome new people who are interested in taking a more active role in the community. So please do get in touch with us if you're keen on being involved, or if you're interested in running a meetup, just like Kieran has done for us with this one today. Get in touch. This meetup that we've organised, timing-wise, it coincides roughly with World Digital Preservation Day, which is officially on this coming Thursday, the 4th of November. So World Digital Preservation Day, thanks Matt, I can see you're putting all those excellent links into the chat, everything I'm talking about here. World Digital Preservation Day, this is a day when the global digital preservation community comes together to celebrate the really positive impact that digital preservation has had, especially in another year where digital information, digital infrastructure has been so instrumental in supporting our global societies. One more thing from me before I hand over to Kieran. To note our code of conduct for the community. As I mentioned, this is a very diverse community from a wide range of social, cultural, and professional backgrounds. So in short, we ask everyone to bring a spirit of respect and friendly inquiry to all interactions here today. We encourage everyone to be familiar with our code of conduct, which is up on our website. If you have any issues today, please contact me or one of our other co-organisers who are here today. You can see Matt's already in the chat there, and the others as they come in will introduce themselves so you know who they are. You can do this by using the direct message function of the Zoom chat box. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kieran.
Wonderful, and just checking you can see my screen.
Got it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jay. And thank you so much to the AusPreserves Community of Practice for helping me to put together today's meetup. It's a really vibrant community, and I'm glad you can all join us today to discuss the politics of preservation. My name is Kieran Hegarty. I'm a PhD candidate at the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT, and I'm joining you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their ongoing connection to country. And I'd also encourage you, if you can, to pay the rent in whatever way you can. We have two guest speakers along with myself as part of today's session, And together we'll be just talking broadly about the unequal effects that documenting, preserving and providing ongoing access to traces of others' lives has on individuals, communities and society. But before I tell you more about today's speakers and discuss the themes for today, I'll quickly go through the housekeeping for today. Please be aware that the first 60 minutes of the event will be recorded and put online after the event. We have 90 minutes scheduled, but we aim to have the presentations and readings finished within the first 60 minutes, leaving plenty of times for casual questions and discussion. I understand some of you may have other commitments, so if you need to head off after the presentations, by all means, but please join us if you can. And you're invited to put any questions or comments in the chat in the bottom of the screen throughout the event. And you can put in questions and comments during the presentations and readings, but in the interests of time, we might save questions and discussions for the final 30 minutes. But before we hear from our speakers, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the themes for the event and where our invited speakers fit into this theme. So today's event is titled The Politics of Preservation, Cultural Collections in Dangerous Times. And here I'm using preservation in its broadest sense, meaning to keep, as something that relies upon coordinated social action to maintain, protect, safeguard, sustain, perpetuate or prolong. And here I'm thinking of preservation as a cultural practice that allows or disallows the continuation of particular knowledge about the world. And the key idea that we'll be discussing is that preservation has effects in the world and that these effects are not evenly distributed. Records preserved in state archives can at once enable connection with family, providing a window into shared histories, while perpetuating colonial violence, settler logics, and outright lies, as our first speaker, Natalie Harkin's work explores. Well-preserved materials can be used to hold powerful institutions and people to account, or they can be used as a tool of surveillance or allow propaganda to continue its life, as I've found in my work on web archives. And collecting institutions find themselves in dangerous times, with funding cuts, culture wars, misinformation, disinformation, and more. I also want to consider the idea that oppressive structures require constant preservation and renewal. And framing it in this way, I hope, offers opportunities to discuss spaces and strategies of resistance and struggle. So today's session is designed to provide a welcoming space, bringing together a range of voices to discuss some of these challenges together. So let me introduce today's speakers. Dr. Natalie Harkin is a Narangga woman and activist poet from South Australia. She is currently a research fellow at Flinders University with an interest in decolonising state archives, currently engaging archival poetic methods to research and document Aboriginal women's domestic service and labour histories in South Australia. Natalie has had her words published and exhibited across galleries, literary journals and poetry collections. Her first poetry collection, Dirty Words, was published by Cordite Books in 2015, and her most recent work, Archival Poetics, is available through Vagabond Press, which I'll hold up to the camera so you can all see it. And if you haven't already, I'd really commend you to seek out a copy of Archival Poetics. It's a really incredible piece of work, as you'll discover. So today, Natalie will be discussing her work with me in a Q&A for around 15 minutes, and we'll give you an opportunity to hear her read from Archival Poetics as well. Following Natalie's reading, I'll be briefly discussing my PhD research on web and social media archiving and explore with you some of the unexpected effects of preserving the life of ephemeral content. Where does this leave practitioners who are tasked with the important role of preservation? And what role do practitioners and collecting processes play in shaping the political life of collections? The aim of this meetup is to think through the politics of preservation together, cognizant that change can only happen collectively. With these questions in mind, our third speaker, Dr. Lisa Gibbons, will discuss translating ideas from theory about politics and ethics into practical tools to address real needs. Lisa is currently a lecturer in the Department of Information Studies at Curtin University. Her research primarily involves digital cultural heritage and social media, but she has a significant interest in community record keeping and community archives, and the interface between the use of social media, personal memory making, and collective memory. Lisa's talk today will focus on the development of a model for practitioners to apply a critical and reflexive approach to their work. So each presenter will talk for around 15 minutes, and at midday here in the East, we'll turn the recording off, and you're encouraged to stay with us for half an hour of questions and casual discussion. So I'll welcome Natalie. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm aware that some people may not be familiar with your work, so I just wanted to start by, if you could tell us how the archive became both part of your life and part of your practice.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Natalie Harkin, and I'm a Narungga woman, born and raised and living and working and talking to you here from Ghana country in South Australia. I live in the western suburbs, and this is where I was born and raised, really. So I haven't done a lot of living anywhere else, but this is definitely home for me. I want to thank you, Kieran, for this very lovely, generous invitation to meet you all. It's great to be reading in the chat where you're all from. So big greetings to everybody. And I just want to acknowledge all the different countries and nations that you are Zooming in from, wherever you are. So I acknowledge my beautiful Ghana country, my elders, all our ancestors, our future and emerging leaders, and that this land is an embodied and living, breathing archive. Wherever we work, wherever we live, wherever we tread, it's this archive that shapes and informs certainly me and my storytelling and the way I work, and the people that I work with as well. So we're very grateful to our elders and the country that we live and work on. So that's just my brief kind of acknowledgement of where I am. As I said, I'm a Narungga woman, so my family have a 3-mission history in South Australia, which is really typical of many Aboriginal people here in South Australia. So there was a lot of movement between missions going back to the mid-1800s. So from Panindi Mission over on the west coast on Nail Country over to what is now known as Raukin, the heart of the Coorong, which was Point Macleay Mission. And then there was this forced movement to Point Pearce Mission, where my nana was born, and there was a lot of intermarrying and a lot of movement, but there was definitely no I guess, agency and self-determination about where people lived. It was very much a forced relocation between all of those missions, depending on what was happening at the time. So my nana was born and raised at Point Pearce, and a lot of our family are buried at Point Pearce. Point Pearce is where she called home, so that's where I identify mostly as a Narungga woman, but just want to acknowledge all of those other connections across South Australia as well. With the Chester, Yates, Walker and Owens families in particular, which are well-known Aboriginal families here. Also want to acknowledge that there are people zooming in, I see, from New York and also from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So a big hello to all of you, and thanks for zooming in, everyone. So I guess my introduction to the archives is, I was just talking to Kieran and Jay earlier that I'm not an archivist. I'm not archive trained in any formal sense, but I started to engage with the state Aboriginal records back in the early 1990s. So over, about 30 years ago. And it was just a really kind of a slow gathering of information, being really surprised, being very excited and interested. It's a bit titillating, you go, oh, I've got a family name in there, so that's really exciting. I'm going to go and have a little, view over there. What's what have they got on my family? Why are all my family members documented here? So it started off being a bit exciting, and then slowly, as I started to read the material, it became very clear to me that this is a really violent space. And so we talk a lot about the violence of the colonial archive in relation to not just our access and the transparency of what exists, but how our families were represented on those records. So we have the official version of our family's stories written on the archive and on the record. And then we have our own lived memory and our lived embodied archive and the oral histories and the blood memory of what our families experience. So I guess it was just really a gathering of information that then became this mountain of information. There were a significant body of archives on my nana's records that I was particularly drawn to do something a bit more academic, but also creative with, because there were so many of them. And they really are a very critical resource of, like, their surveillance files. There's no other way to describe them. It was surveillance from the Aborigines Protection Board on our families. And I guess what I wanted to do was put the spotlight back on the state and take it away from our bodies.
Yeah. And I was wondering if you could maybe invite us to your work on archival poetics with a reading of the poem RSVP, Natalie.
Sure. So you held up archival poetics, which is in a little, I wanted to have that feel of it being in an archive slip. So then there were 3 volumes, and RSVP is taken from volume 1 of archival poetics. Volume 1 is the Colonial Archive. So RSVP. It begins with a quote by one new woman, Judy Watson, who's an artist, an incredible woman, an artist here engaging blood memory in her work. Witness, memory, missing. It is what you overlook in the gaps, the cracks, the in-between silences, which often are the most revealing. Judy Watson from Blood Language, 2009. RSVP. This is an invitation. Bear witness to memory work, to chilling, intimate snapshots, to collective lives, to extraordinary acts of surveillance, to social policy experimentation, to histories of silence and forgetting, to social policy, to dispossession, to colonial amnesia, preservation. This is an invitation extended. Bear witness to rewriting the local, to small rupturing contributions, to larger counter narratives, to multiple ways of sharing the load, to surviving it all. To open up to beyond what you know, to get messy, to wash the blood from your hands, to prepare your body well to receive visitors. Nothing will be easy when you arrive. Please accept.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I'm interested in when that process of gathering that you were talking about, when you first encountered those surveillance files, when it turned into a creative response, and how archival poetics developed as a creative praxis.
So I've been writing poetry for a really long time, and just started off at, just a little closet poet through my teens, as so many people are, and then started to get a bit more serious and just sort of publishing little bits here and there. And for me, I think poetry, very typical to many poets, it's just a way of dealing with an emotion, or dealing with something that you're confronted with. So for me, poetry was a really intuitive way to respond to what I was feeling, being confronted by all of this information. Then I became interested in other poets, artists, creative arts practitioners who were doing similar things, working with archives, poetic responses, but also that kind of academic and the theorising of the archive and the theorising of these histories and colonial history and colonialism. So it became more of a decolonising, writing poetry with decolonising intention. And it was just an intuitive way, really, of dealing with a mountain of records. So I guess what I usually say to people is the only way, when I felt like I was sort of drowning in all of these archives, and the only way to transform out of them was to write poetry and to weave my way out of them, which we'll talk about a bit later. But yeah, so it became a body of work which was central to doing a PhD on these archives. So that was, the PhD was called I Weave Back to You, Archival Poetics for the Record, which was really responding to, well, working with a body of family records from the Children's Welfare Department and the Aborigines Protection Board, specifically on my nana. But I didn't want it to be Nana's story as such. It was really about what was happening in and around and those seething contexts to her life, which have become quite transformative when you enter into those colonial archive spaces.
And Natalie, today's session is about what gets preserved and why. And as I was reading archival poetics, I was struck by the tension between scarcity and abundance. You described sitting in front of this mountain of paper, but within these files, there's all these lies, there's gaps, there's silences. And I just wanted to ask how you embody and reckon with that tension and draw it out in your work.
So it really is the paradox of the archive. So one of the kind of touchstone poetic, I guess, statements or lines from me is archive fever paradox, my blood it pumps where hearts have stopped. And it is that fever of the archive to which Jacques Derrida, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Derrida's response, an archive fever. And it really is that fever to try and get to the origin of something but there is no origin, there is no beginning, there are multiple insights and multiple beginnings, I guess. So the paradox of the archive is exactly what you've said. You know, there's so much information. It's just an incredible record that the Aborigines Protection Board kept on our families, yet it is only one perspective, and what's left out, even though you can see our agency and our voices through the archives, particularly with letter writing from families trying to either get access to children or find out where the domestic service placements are, or wanting daughters to come back from domestic service placements back to family, or, grandfathers writing against the, changes to legislation on lowering the age of child removal. There are just so many instances of our voices being represented, but they're archived in a very particular way, and they're contextualized by the superintendents, the protectors, the matrons, the doctors, the lawyers, the psychologists, whoever it is, in really, in ways that do not represent the true lives of Aboriginal people. So it's very one perspective. So yes, there are these gaps, there are voids, there are omissions, and there are a lot of silences, but they are the really interesting spaces to write into. So we can counter that very easily when you get access to the records. You can see where those omissions are, and we have this right of reply, which Kirsten Thorpe and Shannon Falkhead and so many people have been writing about this really critical decolonising agenda of the archives, and part of that is a right of reply and right of response. So for me, poetry and creative arts and writing into those invisible spaces is kind of what I'm really excited to do and share and compelled to do. Really, it's a very visceral response for me, and I work collectively with a group of women called the Unbound Collective, and that's what we do too, is really kind of responding to these institutions of power that have contained and collected information on our lives. So it is a compelled, visceral kind of reaction and way to reply to those, or not reply. Well, there is the right of reply, but it's also just that compelled response, how you have to react. It's the affective dimension of the archives that I'm really, really interested in, and how you use that to transform not only ourselves, to become really sovereign and self-determining and really know our histories and feel very strong in these spaces, but also how to educate and transform beyond ourselves to contribute to that larger counter narrative of who we are, and yeah, just those larger, national discourses on Aboriginal people and how we're represented, and how that consolidates in the minds of the everyday person, because these institutions of power are knowledge production sites. So we need to be able to get into there and into them all and respond on as many levels as we possibly can.
Yeah. Shall we discuss your work weaving the archive, Natalie?
Yeah, sure. So as I said earlier, the only way intuitively for me to respond to the archives, and that was part of the PhD praxis, I guess the creative arts praxis, was writing poetry, but also physically weaving. What I wanted to do is really liberate the women's voices that I'd seen, so the handwritten letters from my nana and my great grandmother in particular. And there were so many letters on those files that my nana had no idea existed. She knew she'd written the letters, but she didn't know they were kept. So these are letters that were written by her mother, seeking access to her, seeking information about her, or also letters supporting her. Nana was running away from the institutions that she was in. She was always acting up. She was described as being really naughty and unruly and all of these things that were really, really bad descriptors of who she was. But really, it was her agency as an Aboriginal child and an Aboriginal girl to run away or being charged with absconding, etc. So there are so many letters that are written about and for it. It's all about advocacy. And what it showed was a deep family and mother love that really countered the narrative of Aboriginal children being destitute and neglect, which was the legal charge for their removal. So these letters are really, really important that we have access to give that other perspective. So I wanted to liberate their voices out of the colonial archive and out of those kind of darker spaces that represented them in other ways that certainly were not the ways they wanted to be represented and archived. So yeah, this is a Ngarrindjeri basket that I wove, and the basket's been filmed, it's been exhibited. I'd show it to you today, but it's actually in an exhibition at the moment on our domestic service history, because what I wanted to do was take certain statements and letters from their words and weave them on the outer edge of the Ngarrindjeri basket to tell a different story about them. So you can see the paper there. It's kind of a yellowing paper. I experimented with quite a lot of different paper to see what worked really well. And this is a banana leaf paper, which is made and imported from India. And banana leaf paper has these beautiful archiving qualities. It's gorgeous to weave with. It's very soft, but it's also really durable. It doesn't break. So it's just a matter of photocopying those letters onto there and then shredding them and weaving from them. So yeah, it was a really lovely thing for me to do personally. I just really loved being able to do something and transform the archive in that way. And yeah, it was good to do.
Beautiful. And I was wondering if you could read for us either both or a basket to haunt and I weave back to you from the first volume.
Yeah, sure. Okay. A basket to haunt. From fish traps and cradles to coffins, a basket can hold many things. Food, babies, love, trinkets, water, sustenance, bones, burdens, secrets. A basket can carry shared histories forward in new ways with old and new materials, like the carefully crafted handwritten letters from our grandmothers in state archives. A basket can be woven to carry the load a bit lightly. A basket can haunt. I weave back to you. I tear out their words from these records. This shredding of words I tear out for you. I weave your words from these records. This basket of words I weave back to you.
Thank you, Natalie. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask about your engagement with communities like this, practitioners like archivists and librarians. What has been your engagement, and what role does collective action play in decolonising state archives?
Well, the communities that you've got here are amazing. It's really fantastic to know that you exist, and because I didn't really know about the Australasia Preserves Collective before this. So yeah, it's great to know that you're there just kind of talking about these kinds of things, and you know, so many others. But I guess, yeah, there are so many different collectives that I've kind of been made aware of in recent years. Like I said, I'm not really an archivist, but I have certainly been made aware of a lot of great communities like the Indigenous Archives Collective, and I know that there's a really fantastic library network for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander resources and protocols in dealing with these spaces. The state records here in South Australia have got some excellent leadership at the moment, and they're really, really under-resourced. So we have an Aboriginal Families Records and Access team, which is pretty much one person, and now they're doing a bit of succession planning for Andrew Wilson, who's been there for 30 years. So it's really tough kind of for really small teams to doing such a large body of work, because we have so many collections in these spaces that that people just don't know about. Even the institutions themselves don't really know or understand what they hold themselves in so many different collections about our lives. So state records and the State Library of South Australia are really trying hard here in South Australia to respond to that Tandanya Declaration, which was made in 2019, and that was led by the International Council of Archivists, which launched at the Indigenous Matters Summit, challenging and decolonising the archive. So that's known as the Tandanya Declaration, which I'm a signatory to as well. So our institutions here have taken that really seriously. It's taken quite a long time because the cogs turn so slowly in government and in, I guess, in bureaucracies. But we have the very first Aboriginal reference group or advisory group to both state records and the State Library of South Australia, which is coming together. So working with those institutions to look at what that might look like, and having input, along with many other people in South Australia, having input into kind of shaping what that kind of network and advisory group might look like. So that's been really exciting to be a part of. And I guess knowing as well that you've got these incredible organisations like the Australian Society of Archivists, who have got these online training programs, the Indigenous record keeping and archives online training program, and toolkits and, you know, stuff like that. We have the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which has a very strong truth-telling. Well, it's all about truth-telling, and archives are really critical to that. So yeah, so many different repositories and networks and I guess policy frameworks and that. At the moment they are just frameworks, so how institutions pick them up and take them up and apply them with community, with Aboriginal people really leading that space is really the challenge, I think. But it is happening slowly and in different ways. And just want to acknowledge the work of Kirsten Thorpe and Shannon Falkhead again, and really carving out some I guess great theorising as well as practical. So it's the theory as well as the practice of decolonising archives in this space. It's really kind of shaped my thinking around this work as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Natalie, and thank you for your poetry. Where can people stay connected with what you're doing and your research and poetry.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, so I'll be talking for the next 10 minutes. Thank you again to Natalie, and I'll be discussing some of the political effects of preserving the life of ephemeral content. Specifically, I'll be exploring the ethical implications of automatically collecting traces of people's online interactions and making them available on an ongoing basis. And I'll be drawing on a few examples from Australia and around the world to illustrate the political potential of taking something with a very short temporal orientation, like a web page or a social media post, and making it last indefinitely in the archive. First, it's important to understand the reasons why web content is collected by libraries. And in some ways, we can see the incorporation of websites and social media into the collections of national and state libraries as a continuation of their role to collect the written culture of the nation or the state. Yet the scale and character of the web makes collecting in this space quite distinctive. Particularly important for today's talk is the temporal orientation of the web. And you probably had an experience where you're navigating around a web page and you receive a message like this. And this kind of mundane routine experience underscores the fact that, like all content, the web is ephemeral, but the web is particularly or hyperephemeral. So things on the web can appear and disappear unexpectedly, and content can be deleted, a website owner can fail to renew their domain, or pages can change location. But much more common is that content on a given URL will change, and there's good reason for this. When we go to a website, we generally want the most up-to-date information. The ephemeral nature of web content is of obvious concerns to institutions with mandates to collect and preserve public information, as well as those concerned with reliable evidence to hold people and institutions to account. And the rapid pace of technological development and obsolescence led some to speculate that we're in the midst of a so-called digital dark ages. And this was a narrative that was particularly prevalent in the 1990s, but it still persists. And I want to suggest that this creates a sense of urgency around gathering material and reflects a fear that vital information is at risk and the public record could be recklessly manipulated. This has played out dramatically over the past 20 years, and I'll mention just a couple of high-profile cases. So in 2013, the British Conservative Party removed a decade of speeches from their website, with skeptics suggesting the party was evading public scrutiny. And similarly, after the election of Donald Trump, the official White House website removed any mention of climate change, which led to fears that other vital government information and data sources would soon be erased to suit a particular political narrative. Or closer to home, we can think of the example of Energy Minister Angus Taylor, who leaked a forged document to the press while claiming that it came from the City of Sydney website. So these episodes highlight that there's obvious value in having an independent public institution capture, preserve, and provide ongoing access to content that can change or disappear unexpectedly, not least to hold powerful people to account. When web archiving first commenced in the mid-1990s, the responses were somewhat makeshift and rudimentary. And existing copyright law meant that the library had to seek and obtain copyright permission in order to collect and provide access to a snapshot of that website. But over the years, technological developments and changes to copyright law have meant a move towards increased scale. And the first customized software, which automatically captures and follows links, allowed collecting to occur at scale. And you can easily gather millions of websites within hours with little human oversight. And I want to suggest this mix of human and automated decision-making changes how curation of contemporary collections occurs. And it's this process of automation and collecting online traces at scale that sees the unintended and the unexpected emerge, that really amplify the politics of preservation that we're talking about today. So I want to mention a couple of examples that really highlight the political potential of automatically collecting traces of others' lives. So the blog post on the left outlines how the world's largest web archive allows users to upload content or paste a link, and it'll provide free storage or access. However, the article explains that Islamic State sympathisers were using the archive as basically a platform for extremist propaganda, and this allowed propaganda to continue to spread when other publishing platforms were blocked. There might be good reason to include this kind of content in the collections. However, the example shows how dispersed collecting processes can have unexpected consequences. Similarly, the article on the right outlines the life of conspiratorial propaganda about COVID-19 that was shared on social media. After being debunked, the article was flagged and algorithmically demoted by social media platforms and failed to be widely shared. However, the proxy in the web archive went viral, a trend that was repeated for other polemic content. And I saw this too in my recent fieldwork at the National Library. When I was looking at statistics from the Australian Web Archive, I noticed that one of the most accessed sites by far was a really divisive website, where kind of vigilante website, where individuals would name and shame particular individuals. So, and this archive site had been accessed far more than any other. So in an information environment that increasingly favours virality over all else, intervening in this environment through archiving means becoming enmeshed in its logic. But disinformation and propaganda are not the only concerns. Web archiving also forces us to confront tricky questions. Do people have a right to delete their digital traces? While we might want to save a politician's social media presence before it's scrubbed by the user after something embarrassing, we might not always reach the same conclusion. And the distinctions between a public personality and a private individual are not always clear-cut on the web. And do users expect that content on the web is ephemeral, that the conversations that they have on platforms will eventually go down the drain with the companies that hosted them? And the popularity of social media services such as Snapchat and Instagram stories and others are built around the very notion of ephemerality, confounding attempts at collection and preservation, except possibly by social media companies themselves. We can think of those in Afghanistan currently who worked in the public sector or served the occupation or involved with a foreign NGO, who are now rushing to delete traces of their digital lives for fear of retribution from a returning Taliban. Or in the US, where police are increasingly using social media as a surveillance tool to target protesters and disrupt demonstrations. Or the rising rates of technology facilitated abuse and harassment. In this political and social context, how should libraries and archives and institutions like them consider these communities and the vulnerabilities inherent to the activities they participate in as they build publicly available collections of web data? And this is a critical question in dangerous times. So I'm running short on time, but I hope these examples show the unequal effects that documenting, preserving and providing ongoing access to the traces of others' lives has on individuals, communities and society, and how automated and dispersed processes produce unexpected effects in the world. I'll briefly sum up my discussion today, that a few of the political implications of preserving, particularly the web, that might inform our discussion in the final half hour. So first, we need to see curation as a process that is distributed between people and machines. And this distributed labour has implications on what's selected for collections and what isn't. Second, a move towards increased scale raises questions about where humans should intervene in automated decision-making. This is a trend that is accelerating in the cultural sector and in wider society, but it's not without its issues. And lastly, and most importantly, treating preservation as purely a technical or organisational process can overlook that it's a cultural practice that interacts with the politics and ethics of how knowledge is produced, disseminated and authorised in society. So collecting online content brings together, often in unexpected ways, a range of different groups who may have divergent views on what the web is, could, and should be. For me, I think the key question to ask in this context is what is deemed worthy of preservation and who decides? Framing it in this way provides the possibility of seeing preservation as a political and ethical act, which makes it neither wholly good nor wholly bad, but rather, I want to suggest it makes it dangerous. And as Michel Foucault said, if everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do. And I look forward to discussing with you in the final half hour, but first I'll hand over to Lisa for her presentation. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you, Kieran. I'm going to share my screen. So, thank you to for the introduction and the opportunity to speak today. I respectfully acknowledge the elders and custodians of the Whadjuk Noongar Nation, past and present, their descendants and kin. I pay my respects to Noongar Boodja and acknowledge that Bentley campus here in Perth, Western Australia, where I work, is located in a place of great cultural significance and sustains the life and well-being of the traditional custodians, past, present and future, and is valued as a place of shared learning. I want to take the opportunity also to share with you the introduction that I give to my archive students for each teaching period about archives. For the discipline, study and practice of archives, it is important to be aware of and examine your assumptions about the context of knowledge, ownership and rights, and acknowledge that individuals, communities and cultures experience and understand the world in different ways. We'll learn about archival practices in this unit from a Western and ultimately British perspective. All Australian government record keeping was created from and still exists within a British colonial framework. There are many ways to understand how information, memory, records, evidence, and archives are created, classified, shared, valued, and how these kinds of contexts impact on what is preserved for the future. So I try to teach what it means to make a decision to archive and how to incorporate other perspectives and work in collaboration with people outside of the profession who can share knowledge and help us deliver innovation, equity, and improve systems in practice. So today I've been asked to share with you some of my deepest thinking about how archives are formed. For me, this is unfinished business. It's been shaped over many years, a decade, if not more. And at the heart of my thinking is how people decide what is of value, how those decisions are made to preserve, to archive. This is the politics and the power of archives as memory, evidence, and heritage. And the question is so massive, and it's often too much for me to think about and fit into my working life, my current working life. So I actually shelved this kind of thinking that I'm going to be talking about today a few years ago as a luxury, at the same time almost that I published a paper that I'm going to talk about today. I want to thank Kieran for asking me to uncover it and to present to you about it today. And I guess to sort of wrap up that intro, this short story about where I'm at might act as a bit of a warning about the kind of space you're going to need to build for the next 15 minutes or so. Okay, So Kieran used the term critical archival praxis. It's there in the materials, promotion materials for today's talk session, AusPreserve session. It's not actually a term that I use, but as an archival educator and researcher, it is an area I'm deeply passionate about. So praxis literally means practice, and it also means putting theory into practice. It's also about the practical engagement with tools. In archival praxis, we can talk about the use of technologies, methods, procedures, workflows, life cycles, processes, policies, and that kind of thing. But looking at archival praxis in this way doesn't necessarily show or explain or reveal what is missing or what's being assumed. And this is where the critical part comes in. And so where archival praxis produces outcomes, critical archival praxis examines and questions the assumptions and the processes in order to transform them. Now, I call these things, this process, the practice of reflexivity. So reflexivity is the way of taking account of yourself to understand your impact on what is being done. It is about each individual, and it comes from individuals. And it's about an individual way of thinking, learning, and doing that can identify and expose underlying principles, beliefs, and assumptions, challenge and examine systems of cultural and knowledge production, and explore and question design, context, representation, and impact of archives and archival systems. But also importantly, it is a way, reflexivity is a way to study all of these kinds of issues within theoretical and practical settings. So I believe that each individual has the capacity, and if you're an archivist or work with archives, the responsibility to transform archival praxis. Now, this idea isn't mine, it comes from, and my influence is Terry Cook, eminent archival scholar and theorist, who wrote that archival concepts are not universal truths, but are constantly evolving in response to changing conditions. I believe that the smallest act, such as interpreting an existing policy or writing a procedure, has the potential to transform archival work towards radical, beneficial, and equitable outcomes. And that's the sort of premise that I start from. Now, over the next few minutes, I'm going to introduce you to some theory that I have been looking at or attempting as part of my unfinished business to develop into methods and tools that can be used for archival transformation. This is called, some of you might be familiar with this already, this is called the mediated record keeping model. It's a conceptual model, a theoretical model that I developed a few years ago. A simple explanation of what you're seeing on the screen is that it represents the various structures and systems that contribute to the creation, use, and value of records and archives as memory, evidence, and heritage, their use and reuse over time. Now, I debated when preparing for this talk whether or not to explain to you the model, but I decided against it because sometimes it's better to see how it works rather than hear what the concepts are. But if you are keen on understanding anything about how it was created or the theory behind it, I'm going to share some references, and I can share my slides if you would like, where this model is explained in relation to the mapping that I'm going to be talking about today, as well as some other places where the model's explained. Now, I proposed the idea that this model could be used as a reflexive tool for praxis to build a map of stories, which can lead to a deeper analysis, an exploration or exposing of opportunities in order to transform. The only thing that probably is really important to know before we start is that each label, so these are all labels within the structures and systems, I call them nodes. So it's a node of interaction. And they can refer to different kinds of things: an event, a task, meaning, object, person, group, technology, a technology system, a role, or a value. And so the mapping starts with the idea that the person undertaking the modeling or the mapping is a co-creator. And the modeler is situated in the co-create space at the sort of instant of creation. And if we do that, if we put the modeler as in this space, they are now integral and contextual part of the story that is about to unfold on how archives are formed. So the example I'm using is what I talk about in the paper, and this is a video that I've talked about for more than a decade now. One of my favorite videos on the internet. It's hilarious. It is called, as you can see, Zorba the Greek Yongle style. It was performed at the Imagining Festival by the Chuki Dancers in 2007. And some of you might remember seeing the Chuki Dancers for the first time on Australia's Got Talent in 2008. I'm sorry about this. So this is where the video looks like, and this is the description of the video. This has been changed a few times over the last few years, actually, and added to. And that's there. I know it's a little bit weird because of the way that I had to sort of group it, gather it all in. Okay. So this video was acquired sometime after 2007 by the Australian National Film and Sound Archive. So I want to talk about that. That's what we're talking about today. Now, this is the catalogue entry from the National Film and Sound Archive for the video. I took this yesterday, so I've been taking screenshots of the same catalogue entry for a decade. It's the same as it has been for a decade. I'm guessing that this, what they're referring to as the video here, is the same because this summary is the same as the information that's in the YouTube video that you just saw that's on YouTube. Okay. So the way that I'm going to use the model today is to talk a little bit about archival description. We're going to sort of evaluate this idea of how we represent an archival object. So the first action is to add the name and identity of the actor who is creating the archival description as a co-creator in the first dimension. So we can pretend that I'm an archivist and I sit in that co-create dimension, and potentially I work for the National Film and Sound Archive. And so I would add those kind of contexts related to that. And we start to sort of build some ideas around where I belong and how those contexts might start to be part of my identity that can impact on the way that we would undertake archival description. So I'm talking about procedures, about policies, about the role that the organisation might play as an institution, a memory institution, and any other context that might be considered relevant. Now, I'm going to show you the first part of how to do this mapping, or the way that I've done it, one way that I've done it. I've done it a few ways now. And it's not got everything in it because it's too complex. It gets a bit complex. So there's the co-creator as an archivist, and it's got a relationship to this idea of a self-identity. Then we can start to build some other or add some other co-creators. And we have these, and this comes from the description on YouTube. We have YouTube itself. We have Coda Joker, who was the person that uploaded the video. We have Frank, who was the producer, took the video, shot the video, and Lionel, who's the main dancer in the Chuki Dancers. And then, so this is all in the co-create and thinking about identity. We can add some contexts about them as well, related to the kind of transactions that might be occurring, such as shooting video of an event, use of video technologies. So we're demonstrating a learning, we're demonstrating technology. We can understand the video as evidence of moving image of a dance, and it's also evidence of moving image shared on YouTube. And it's also a story being told of fusion of modern Yongle movements with the Greek Zorba. Then we can start to develop some more kinds of ideas. So moving within those different nodes of interaction and context related to Frank Lionel, the National Film and Sound Archive, the Imagining Festival, Tiaba, which is the production company, and the role of YouTube as a technology. So here I've just got a few examples. So Lionel's a performer, a dancer, an educator, and a community member. We have Frank from Elko Island, producer in Tiaba Media, and he's a video producer. So it starts to sort of give us this kind of contextual picture that's starting to tell a story about the different identities that can interact and made up the production of this just single video. YouTube here is a location of social media, and well, used to be community and participation. Well, maybe update that version now, because it's a little bit different sort of model, a different sort of technology. Now, if we start to think about the Zorba video as being acquired and preserved within a national collecting institution whose remit is film and sound, so it's got a very specific kind of purpose, these contexts influence how the video is elevated from a personal and community memory action, or plays that kind of role in a shared system, to evidence of cultural practices and made significant as collective memory. The decisions related to this also impact. So the decisions related to how the National Film and Sound Archive decided that this video was one that they wanted to collect impacts on how YouTube as a technology is valued as a legitimate place to find and acquire evidence of culture. But YouTube is also a place that isn't able to preserve it. It has to be brought into the institution in order to preserve it. But it raises questions about what is the video evidence of, according to Lionel or Frank, who owns the video as it exists on YouTube. And if we go back and have a look at the YouTube info, there's a licensing agreement on there. Do other videos exist of the Imagining Festival? Did Frank just record this one video for YouTube? Is there other videos somewhere? Like, what are the connections to what this is actually evidence of? And then we start to dig a little bit deeper. I think I might have, do I have any more? Yeah. For example, identifying evidential qualities of the modeler's own frameworks of reference, including policy standards and procedures and systems that support them. So if I think I've got it up here. If we go back and have a look at that catalogue entry in the National Film and Sound Archive, and particularly the categories of folk music, Indigenous as subject, Indigenous themes or stories. It sort of raises a question, are these appropriate categories? Is it useful for this video, and how it connects to other kinds of content across the catalogue, right? It also raises a question for me about, would members of the Yolngu community who are at the festival, or the Chuki dancers, the members of the group, or any of their descendants in 150 years' time, would they go to the National Film and Sound Archive to find something like this and consider searching under those categories? I mean, what role do they play in the design of that catalogue? Okay, so this is really only the beginning of a mapping, starting with archival description and looking at past actions. So mapping the past looks at existing frameworks, systems and structures to seek gaps and opportunities. But I also think that we can use this model to assess the present, which can include evaluation and measuring current practices, things like user interaction, and setting benchmarks for future assessment. It can also be used to map the future to design archives by examining the structures that currently exist in frameworks, and thinking about what could be included in those, making decisions about people, systems, and the role of archives, what you want it to do, so more strategically. And together, the three mapping functions, past, present, and future, can be deployed over time, not just once, to contribute to new and transformative practices and outcomes. So just to wrap up, I'm really interested in how the model can be used as a digital archives design tool. That's my sort of key area. Although there's a couple of topics that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. And I, reflect on a little bit in the, in the space where I get the opportunity to do that. So one of them is documenting community responses to COVID-19 by collecting institutions in Australia and worldwide. So there's some really interesting things in that space. And I've set some assignments for my students about that, which has revealed some interesting stuff. Government digital transformation strategies and building and evaluating digital archives for use and reuse. And then how this model might work with other kinds of models we use in this space, the OAIS model, the web archiving lifecycle model, as well as strategies and frameworks like the Tandanya Declaration, professional ethics and identity. And so it kind of brings me back to my theme about unfinished business. How to use the model is unfinished business. This is kind of me thinking about its potential use, but building the methods and systematic methods is something that is yet to be done. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Okay.
It was wonderful to hear you talk more about that. A really useful model for thinking through the kind of implications of archives that are, and how they unravel over time is really complex and interesting. We have about 25 minutes left for questions, discussion. So if you have any questions for either Natalie, myself, Lisa, or you just want to raise some thoughts, you can either unmute yourself and speak, or you can put your questions in the chat. I think Akari has your hand up. So
yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone for your presentations. I have a question for Lisa Gibbons. I would like to know whether you have published research on this video or in the model for archives, because actually the way you are conceptualizing the video within relationships and roles on video production is very similar to what I am doing right now with the indigenous people of Japan. So I would like to know if you have anything.
I do. Thank you. Thank you for asking. I didn't show you the final slide, which has got some citations on it. So there's been the paper that I was talking about or referring to today was published in 2018, and I can share, I'll share the citation for you. If anybody wants a copy of the paper, just let me know and I can grab a copy. And the model itself is written up in a couple of different places in my PhD dissertation, as well as a conference paper from 2015, which I've got some links to as well. And yeah, so the video I mostly have used, it's only discussed in that one paper, the 2018 paper, but I have talked about it in presentations for a really long time, but they don't necessarily exist.
Thank you very much.
I had a question for Natalie, if that's okay. I was interested in how you talk about the violence of the archive box, and I was wondering how the archive was presented to you, how it was classified and packaged, and how that framed your response in your poetry, or as an embodied reckoning with that.
Yeah, I've been given the archives in many different forms depending on the repository, but the body of work that I did for my PhD in relation to those Children's Welfare Department files and Aborigines Protection Board files were collated through LinkUp. So many of you will be familiar with LinkUp as an organisation which sits in South Australia. So there's LinkUp organisations all around the country, but in South Australia, there's one in Nunkara Aboriginal Health Service. So I didn't go to LinkUp to find family, but I did go to LinkUp to try and get some records on behalf of my nana, who was just asking some questions about why she was removed from her family when she was clearly loved and clearly in a community family setting. So she was just wondering what was going on with her mother at the time when she was actually in a domestic service placement with a white Adelaide establishment family. So, so they handed it to me in a very thick ring-bound file, and it was slid across a table to me in this ring-bound file with myself and my cousin, and they'd highlighted with little post-it notes some pages that they deemed to be very sensitive and really potent, when indeed the whole archive in and of itself was a very potent record. So for me, I was really interested in what some people deem as being sensitive material, when even the fact that there is any one file note recorded on an Aboriginal person is in of itself a sensitive document and file note. The fact that it's there in the first place is part of that archival violence because of the way it got there in the first place. So that was that body of files. So I was interested in, but I've also been in those repositories at State Records, and I've seen the archive boxes, and I've opened the archive boxes, and I've had access to touching the original papers that, you know, now you can't do it, which is a very good thing, because the original, you know, documents from the late 1800s and early 1900s are literally just crumbling in your hand. So they need to be preserved and digitized. But I have touched that fading yellowing paper, and that's why I chose to use that banana leaf paper to weave some of those letters, because it had that translucent quality. It looks very fragile, but actually it's quite durable and strong, and it will always remain. So I was interested in that kind of thinking about the paper and the archive as being, as you said, ephemeral, but also very, you know, the fact there is this dust will always linger, and it's now made an imprint on me, and I have made an imprint on it. So yeah, I've seen the archive boxes. I presented my thesis in a Solander box, which was made by an archivist who does archive, who like, it's an old art. It's like bookbinding and, you know, stuff like that. So it was a bookbinder archive box maker who makes archive boxes for the State Library and also the Art Gallery of South Australia and the Museum of South Australia. And that archive Solander box was imprinted, or had, sorry, it was embossed with that same banana leaf paper that I used throughout different iterations of the thesis. So I wanted to present it as a cultural artifact and an archive box in of itself as well. So I'm really interested in that idea of the box, the opening up of something. What is that? The dark space, the light that gets in, what's, you know, the entrapment, the preservation, and, you know, all of those kinds of things, and how we write into those invisible spaces that tell of the gaps and the omissions.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Does anyone have any comments or questions for any of our speakers? Otherwise, I have lots of questions for. So, I mean, I'll raise something. That something I'm interested in is surfacing the invisible work of, or often invisible work of archivists and institutions like them in shaping what we come to see. And I was wondering how those traces of work are documented in the archive, if at all, and what traces were left behind on the archives that you experienced, Natalie.
Sorry, what was the question?
The question was what traces of the archivist or different people were on the archives themselves.
Yeah, so I guess the main people that document the body records that I'm looking at in terms of the State Aborigines Protection Board are the Protection Board members. They're the superintendents. They're the protector of Aborigines. I'm looking at the Aboriginal Women's Domestic Service file. So it's the local farmers or property owners or station owners who are writing into the protector or the local mission superintendents to request domestic servants to go and work for them. So there was that exchange of labour between the missions, and, you know, Aboriginal people were seen as the market solution to the Aboriginal problem in terms of also a labour shortage of domestic servants. And that was also a key assimilation measure. So you see how these traces of the policies and the very close connection and the interrelation between the Aborigines Protection Board and the Children's Welfare Board, and how those related policies are enmeshed, targeting girls in particular for child removal in order to then be trained into domestic servants as a key assimilation measure. So that was really interesting to me to see that very transparent on the archive when you start to read those records, because we know it, we see it written sort of abstractly, but then when you get into the records and you can see how that's actually how it manifests on a very real, personal, family kind of level. It's quite confronting and quite revealing. But you see all sorts of file notes, you know, typical to, you know, so they're just a tiny little file note or a little message in the corner of a page that's not meant to be official, but that can actually be really revealing. There was one matron who wrote this tiny little in her handwriting, and she wrote something like, "More surveillance is needed for this girl." And that wasn't meant to be part of the official documentation, which was all typed up, but that tiny little file note was so significant because it really upped the ante with it, you know. So it was officially recorded, but it was like an unofficial file note, if that makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, there's lots of traces of all those kinds of little things, which are really, really interesting, really important, and you know, we can put our gaze and analysis on it now. You know, so many people say to me, "Oh, but it was just the thinking of the day. It was just the language of the day." But my response is always, well, it wasn't the language of the day of my family or our families. We didn't describe ourselves like this. We didn't record ourselves like this, and we had no control or agency over how we were represented and how those oppressive government policies really you know, played out in the mundane intimacies of the everyday. So, you know, these are really intimate acts of oppression and violence that are become really transparent when you get access to these archives.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, underscores the importance of your work, Natalie, which we all appreciate. There's a question for Jean in the chat. I'll just read it out and we can divvy it up. Does anyone have thoughts on the politics of which archives get funded? For example, large government institutions versus community archives. Lisa, I know you've done some work on the Community Heritage Grants Scheme, and looking at that, did you want to talk to that question?
I can. I think it's an interesting. I have a lot of thoughts about it. I mean, I don't think archives are funded at all well anywhere, really. Government archives, community archives. You know, we talk a lot about that. I talk about that in class, in my preservation class, around the problems with funding. I mean, you look at the National Film and Sound Archive, crowdsourcing funding. You know, the National Archives have, you know, finally got some funding for digitization, but not the right kind of, like not the amount they really need, and had to go down an advocacy path rather than secure funding. And at the same time, you know, there's a paper that I wrote on community archives, the most recent one, then the other in Australia, is sort of exploring who's talking about it. And then there was a paper on the Community Heritage Grant Scheme, which is administered by the National Library, and in relation to, you know, structures and decisions in those spaces. I think it's a complex area, you know, and funding is never enough in any sort of way. We also have the university sector, quite a few people here from the university archive sector as well. And there's some sort of gaps and opportunities around Australia in relation to that as well. So potentially, you know, there's a lot and there's not much more that I can say about that. There's probably people who are working in those places who might have better sort of contribution in relation to that, who's in our audience.
Yeah. There's a question from Barbara Reid, which I think is for me. Do you have any thoughts around the role of the Internet Archive versus the role of collecting institutions. Perhaps it emerges through takedown notices or access policies. Are what I'm going to call the collecting tags of web crawls in institutions transparent? The answer to that is no. I mean, a lot of what is made available, so my work, just to give some context, I am spending time with web archivists looking at how these collections come to be and the kind of everyday decision making that goes into their creation. And I mean, and all of that's very interesting, but it's not represented in a snapshot of a website that's made available online that's somewhat partial, that was collected at a particular time or date. And the reason for that is that it's complicated by the use of the technology that's used to establish those archives. So a lot of the time, the people doing the collecting don't know what is being collected necessarily, or how it emerged in its current form, which makes it a really interesting space, but also opens up all this political potential that I discussed in those various examples around the role of the Internet Archive versus the role of collecting institutions. I mean, the Internet Archive really dominates this space, and they're able to dominate this space because they're not-for-profit and they're not connected to the state, and they don't follow copyright law really. They have takedown notices that the people can respond to if they find themselves in the archive and they want themselves removed, or if there's offensive content or illegal content. But they're driven by a sense of urgency, and the fear that it'll be lost if it's not collected now. So that kind of urgency, I think it's good to think of it not just as a fundamentally good thing, but as a kind of cultural practice that generates some possibilities that are not necessarily foreseen. So that's my response. Andrew Waugh says, thank you, Natalie, for talking about the effects of the archives on you. The positive thing is that the archives do show how the officials thought. Those actions were deliberate and thought through. That's why those file notes are part of the official record. It's exactly why archivists keep them, but it's terribly tough for the descendants reading it today.
Yes, I agree. I think that's why I really do love these archives so much. And I talk about the paradox of the record, and it's become quite vexed, and it's a really interesting kind of relationship I have with the archive, because they are the records that I love and the records that I hate. I want to preserve them. I want to, in terms of the archives that I keep, I want to keep collecting them, and I have this kind of feverish immersion with them, but at the same time I want to blow them up. How they represent them. But it is about putting the spotlight firmly back on the state, like I started off with when I was speaking earlier, putting the spotlight back on the state and that colonizing agenda and that assimilating agenda, and the language of the state, the machinations of the state, how those intimate relationships that that colonialism manifests in any country around the world. And Anne Stoller just articulates it so well, and all of that prolific work that she's done in this space. It's really important to put the archive. The archive is in and of itself the object of inquiry, rather than the people that it contains. And that's what I think Indigenous peoples around the world are really interested in, this decolonizing space. It's really about how we put the spotlight back on those machinations of state rather than on our bodies. So, so yes, it is really important. They are tough to read, but it's important that we read them, and it's important that we transform them and transform out of them in a way that's really loving and just and connects with people and the humanness of us, rather than being the object of inquiry or a particular representation of who we are. So it's about, I think, returning the humanity of our families, and we try and do that in as many ways as we possibly can. But the archive is definitely one source of which we can respond and reply and have access to. It's really important.
Yeah, and Natalie mentioned the work of Anne Stoll, and I'd strongly recommend everyone to pick up her book from 2010. The name escapes me now, but it's about colonial archives in what is now Indonesia. Jay asks, I wonder if there are some first practical steps we can take as practitioners to implement any of the thinking or models for doing we've seen today. Or is it a matter of firstly discussing these ideas more broadly in our circles as advocacy? Lisa, did you want to talk to that question, and maybe how your students respond and how they go about going into the workforce and thinking about these models and any barriers they come up against or challenges?
Yes. Okay. So it's a good question. The honest answer is that we don't teach the practical use of models. So I do introduce this as an optional reading, but I honestly don't have the time to go through this kind of work with people. We do, of course, teach the theoretical models that underpin a lot of Australian record keeping practice, the continuum model, etc. Again, related to more to do with thinking. But to come to Jay's question, the practical steps, I think that a lot of practical steps are being sort of undertaken. We can see the Australian Society of Archivists have built some of those learning materials that sort of expand on or explore these kinds of areas. But my kind of thinking is sort of the models, the way that it presents, my model is about a sort of very abstract, high concept kind of ideas. And it's really hard, as we see even in the conversation, to bring it down into what it might look like. So it has to be kind of workshopped, first of all, in a place to be able to develop something like a method that's systematic, that can then be repeated somewhere else, and just testing it out and trying it out. If anybody wants to do that, call me. I'm here, right? We can have a go if I get the opportunity, we'll see what we can do. But yeah, that's what I sort of advocate for. We have to do something. We have to literally work it, and potentially there's advocacy, but I think the opportunity for advocacy does exist alongside literally doing the work with it.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And it's come to 12:30, so I just wanted to say thank you again to Dr. Natalie Harkin and Dr. Lisa Gibbons for joining us today. I really appreciated your insights and hearing more about your work. And I also wanted to thank Jay and Matthew and the others involved in AusPreserves for allowing me to collaborate with you on this event. So Jay, did you have anything you wanted to say to wrap up?
Thanks so much, Kieran. Just a massive thank you to you for all of the work that you put in to organising this day. Thank you as well, Natalie, Lisa, for sharing your work with us. It is so good to combine our communities and to discuss such in-depth topics. Thank you so very much. I've popped a whole bunch of things and links into the chat for folks to check out. Firstly, this is, as I mentioned, our last meetup for the year. We'll be back in February for our 4th birthday. Who would have thought 4 years would go so very quickly? but that's when we'll be back. But get in touch with us if you want to become more active, if you've got a topic that you're researching or thinking about, just as Kieran, Natalie and Lisa have demonstrated today. It's easy to set up these meetups now that we have this community, so get in touch with us. Check out World Digital Preservation Day, and thank you. Amplify the messages in your circles, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you again, Jay. And we'll finish up the meeting now. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely end to the year.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie.
See you later.
See you, Lisa.